My grandson was sitting on a bench outside the Loblaws on Rideau Street, with a backpack between his knees and his little sister asleep against his shoulder when I found him. I almost drove past. It was 7 in the evening. February. And the wind coming off the Ottawa River had teeth in it. I had been on my way home from my accountant's office when something made me slow down. I don't know what it was. A grandmother knows things she has no business knowing. I pulled the Volvo to the curb and stepped out. He looked up, and I saw his eyes red at the edges, trying very hard to hold it together. He was 14 years old, and he was doing a decent job of it. His sister, Madeleine, was 6, and she had her mittens tucked under her cheek like a pillow. Gran, he said. Just that one word. I looked at the 2 suitcases beside the bench. The proper kind, with wheels and zippers. Someone had packed them carefully. That detail told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been coming. "Where is your mother?" I said. He swallowed. Dad said she had to leave. His father told her she had until noon, and then he had the locks changed. Mom dropped us off here because she didn't want us at the shelter. She said you would come. She had not called me. Neither had he. Because my son-in-law had taken both their phones 3 days earlier over some argument about screen time, and my daughter had been too afraid to ask for them back. She had used the payphone outside the drugstore to call her cousin, who had called me. I did not say any of this to my grandson. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at Madeleine sleeping on the bench in February. "Get your sister." I said, "I'll get the bags." I am 67 years old. I was born in Sudbury, Ontario, the daughter of a woman who ran a bookkeeping service out of our kitchen and a man who worked 31 years for Inco. I have outlasted 2 business recessions, 1 divorce, a cancer diagnosis at 53 that turned out to be manageable, and a son-in-law who had been, for the last 8 years, quietly dismantling my daughter's confidence the way water dismantles limestone. Slowly, without appearing to do anything at all. His name was Derek. His father's name was Gerald. Gerald owned a mid-sized property management company out of Canada, 12 residential buildings, mostly in the west end of the city. He was the kind of man who called himself self-made and meant it as a warning. When my daughter Claire had first brought Derek home, Gerald had shaken my hand at the door and looked at our house, a modest, semi-detached in Westboro, and made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. I had noted it and said nothing. Over 8 years, I had watched Gerald's opinions work their way into Derek's mouth. Claire couldn't manage money properly. Claire was too emotional for real decisions. Claire's family, meaning me, didn't understand how business worked. Derek repeated these things to Claire the way a man reads from a manual, without inflection, without anger, which made it worse. Anger you can argue with. A manual you cannot. They had been living in a house in Barhaven that Gerald owned. He had never charged them rent. A generosity that came with conditions no one had written down, but everyone had understood. When Gerald decided those conditions had been violated, and the reason he gave my daughter was that she had spoken back to him at Christmas dinner, had said simply and quietly that she disagreed with something he'd said about his grandchildren's schooling, he gave her 30 days. Then revised it to 1. Then changed the locks while she was at work. Claire was staying with her cousin in Gloucester. She had no money to speak of. Derek had managed their finances for 6 years. Another kindness with conditions, and her access to the joint account had been suspended the same morning as the locks. I know this because that night, after I had settled the children with soup and television and made up the guest room, I sat at my kitchen table and I made a list. I am my mother's daughter. I do not make decisions under emotion. I make lists. The list had 3 columns. What I knew, what I needed to find out, what I could do, The third column was longer than Derek or Gerald would have expected. That was their error. They had looked at our house on that first evening and made a calculation. They had calculated wrong. What they did not know, what Claire did not even fully know, because I had not wanted to burden her with it during the difficult years, was that I had spent the last 11 years building something. After my own divorce, at 52, I had taken the settlement and the savings and a very clear head, and I had purchased my first income property. A duplex in Hintonburg, then another, then a small commercial unit on Wellington West that I leased to a physiotherapy clinic. I had been careful and I had been quiet, and I had reinvested everything. And by the time my grandson found me on Rideau Street, my portfolio consisted of 9 properties across the city, managed under a numbered company that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know to look. Gerald owned 12 buildings. I owned 9. But Gerald's 12 buildings had a problem I had recently become aware of. Because Gerald's property manager was a man named Tim, who had worked for me briefly in 2019 before I let him go for sloppy record keeping. And Tim had a habit, under pressure, of talking. 2 months earlier, Tim had mentioned something to a contractor we both knew. The contractor mentioned it to me over coffee because he thought it was interesting, and I was the kind of person he talked to about interesting things. What Tim had mentioned was that 3 of Gerald's Canada buildings had outstanding work orders from the city fire suppression issues. Ventilation, in one case, that had been deferred through a combination of extensions and, Tim implied, a relationship with someone in the permits office that was becoming difficult to maintain. The deadline on 2 of those work orders was April. It was February. I wrote this in my 3rd column. I spent the next week making phone calls. Not to lawyers yet, too early for that. I called the property management contacts I had built over 11 years. I called a woman I knew who worked as a paralegal and understood landlord-tenant law in Ontario better than most lawyers I'd met. I called my accountant, the same one I had been leaving when I found the children on the bench. My accountant's name was Patricia, and she had been doing my books for 9 years. She was thorough, and she was discreet, and when I explained what I needed, she put her pen down and looked at me for a moment. "You want to make an offer on the Canada buildings," she said. "Not all 3. 1. The one with the ventilation citation. The one that will cost the most to remediate." She looked at her screen. "That building has tenants. It's generating income. I know. I don't want to displace the tenants. I want the liability. I want to be the person who remediates it properly." I paused. I want Gerald to need me to want it. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. "Just slightly. I'll pull the assessment." The assessed value of the building was $4. 2 millions. Based on the outstanding citations and the remediation costs, which Patricia helped me calculate from the contractor's estimates, the realistic offer was $3. 4 millions? It was at the outer edge of what I could finance without liquidating anything. But it was achievable. I did not make the offer directly. I had a colleague in commercial real estate, a woman named Susan, who had sold me 3 of my own properties, approached the listing as a buyer's agent acting for a numbered company. Gerald's company responded within 48 hours. They were motivated. The April deadline had a way of motivating people. What happened in the following 3 weeks I will describe simply because the details are less important than the shape of it. Gerald accepted an offer conditional on inspection and financing. While that process was underway, I did 2 other things. The first was that I called a family lawyer my paralegal friend had recommended, a woman with an office on Elgin Street who specialized in financial abuse within marriages. I brought Claire to that meeting. It was the first time I had seen my daughter sit up straight in a chair in several years. The lawyer explained what financial abuse meant in a legal context, what documentation would support a claim, and what Claire's rights were with respect to the joint account and the matrimonial home. Even one owned by a third party. Claire said very little during the meeting. On the way out, she stood on the sidewalk in the cold, and she cried for a few minutes, and then she stopped, and she said, "I should have called you sooner. You called when you could." I said, "That's enough." The second thing I did was contact the city's bylaw and building standards office and ask, as a concerned community member, about the status of the outstanding work orders on Gerald's Kanata properties. This was public information. Anyone could ask. I asked. The officer I spoke with confirmed the April deadline and confirmed that failure to comply would result in an order to vacate and a referral to the city's legal department. I wrote this down and I gave it to Susan, and I asked her to make sure the information found its way into the conversation with Gerald's team in a way that felt organic. Like due diligence. Like something a serious buyer would naturally discover. It did. The negotiation shifted. Gerald came down another $140,000. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I was not trying to destroy Gerald. I was not trying to ruin his business or take everything he had. I am 67 years old, and I have learned that revenge shaped like destruction costs the person wielding it almost as much as the person receiving it. I have seen women my age pour years into the kind of revenge that's really just grief wearing a disguise. What I wanted was simpler. I wanted my daughter to be safe. I wanted my grandchildren to sleep in a warm house without listening for footsteps. And I wanted Gerald to understand, clearly and without ambiguity, that when he looked at my house on that first evening and made that small, dismissive sound, he had miscalculated in a way that would be instructive. The sale closed in late March. I owned the building. I immediately engaged a contractor for the remediation work and filed the progress reports with the city on time. The tenants remained. 2 of them sent me cards. One of them, an elderly man on the second floor, left a plate of butter tarts outside my office, which I did not deserve but appreciated. While this was happening, Claire's lawyer had obtained a court order restoring her access to the joint accounts. The balance, it turned out, had been significantly reduced in the weeks since the separation. Derek had moved quickly, but not, it turned out, quickly enough, because the lawyer had also obtained full disclosure of financial records going back 6 years, and what those records showed was a pattern of transfers to a personal account that Claire had not known existed, amounts that, over time, added up to something a judge would find interesting. I was not present for most of this. It was Claire's case, and Claire's lawyer, and Claire's fight. I had done what a mother can do, which is hold the door open and make sure the light was on. What happened after that belonged to my daughter. What I can tell you is what happened on a Tuesday in April. Derek called me. I was in my kitchen reading. I almost didn't answer. I answered. He did not know. At that moment, the full extent of what had been set in motion. He knew the account order had been issued. He did not yet know about the financial disclosure. He called because Gerald had told him to call. I think, though I am speculating, he said that things had gotten complicated, and he hoped there was a way to handle things within the family without involving courts and lawyers. I let him talk. He talked for several minutes. He used the word reasonable 4 times. He said that of course Claire and the children were welcome back. When he finished, I said, "I appreciate the call. Derek." He paused. "So you'll talk to Claire. I'll pass along the message." I said, "But I want to say something to you before I go." He waited. "I want you to think about the evening you first brought Claire to meet me. I want you to think about what your father said when he shook my hand. What sound he made." Silence. I noticed. I said, "I've noticed everything. For 8 years. I didn't say anything because I thought Claire needed time and I didn't want to push her toward anything she wasn't ready for. That was my choice. And I've made my peace with it. I paused. But I want you to understand that I was paying attention the entire time. I want you to understand that clearly. Another silence. The building in Canada, he said finally. Not a question. More like a man placing a piece on a board. Properties are for sale every day. I said. I buy ones I believe in. He didn't say anything else. Derek and Claire's separation proceeded through the courts over the following months. It was not easy. These things are never easy, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. There were difficult nights and difficult conversations, and at least one evening where my daughter sat at my kitchen table and cried for an hour, and I sat beside her and didn't try to fix it. Just stayed there. Which is sometimes the only useful thing. Madeline and my grandson lived with me for 4 months. My grandson helped me with the gardens in May and started, somewhere around the second week, to tell me things he didn't tell his parents. Madeline learned how to make butter tarts, which she called the special ones, and which she would make, she announced, for every person she ever loved. I did not point out that this might become inconvenient. Gerald's remaining Canada buildings met their compliance deadlines. Barely. After he secured financing at terms that were, from what Susan heard, through professional channels, not favorable. He did not make any further statements about bloodlines or families or property. Whether this was wisdom or simply exhaustion, I don't know. It doesn't matter much to me either way. Claire found a 2-bedroom apartment in Westboro, 4 blocks from my house. In September, the settlement gave her enough to furnish it properly and a child support arrangement that her lawyer had worked hard for. On the day she moved in, I drove over with a casserole and a plant and found her standing in the empty living room looking at the walls. She had chosen a pale yellow for the main room. It was still drying. She turned when she heard me and she looked like herself. Not the version I had watched disappear over 8 years. The one that flinched at disagreements and prefaced every sentence with an apology. The original one. The one who was born stubborn and bright and occasionally exasperating, which is to say, my daughter. It smells like paint, she said. It'll air out, I said. She took the casserole and set it on the counter and came back and hugged me for a long time in the empty room. I held on. I am 67 years old, and I know that you hold on when you have the chance. Afterward, we sat on the floor because the furniture wasn't in yet and ate the casserole out of the dish with 2 forks, and she told me about her plans. She was going back to school. She had already contacted Algonquin College about their accounting program. The irony was not lost on either of us, and she had an interview at a firm in Centertown that did bookkeeping for small businesses. She had her mother's head for numbers. Had always had it. But had been told for long enough that she didn't, that she'd begun to believe it. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that I had a numbered company that needed a sharper set of eyes on the books and that Patricia was not going to be my accountant forever. Some things you let arrive on their own schedule. What I said instead was, "Your grandmother would have liked you very much." Claire looked at me. The one from Sudbury. She ran her business out of the kitchen. Knew every number. Every year. Never missed one. People underestimated her because of where she worked and what she charged, and because she didn't announce herself. I looked at the yellow walls. You have that in you. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Gran. When are we going home? She was quoting Madeline, who had asked me that question on the second night. Curled up in the guest room with her mittens still on because she'd refused to take them off. I had sat on the edge of the bed and said, You are home. My darling. You've always been home here. You already answered that one. I said. She laughed. It was the full laugh. The real one. It came up from somewhere deep, and it filled the yellow room and went out through the window into the September air over Westboro. That sound is why I do what I do. Not the buildings. Not the numbers. Not the satisfaction of watching a calculation correct itself. That laugh, the original one, coming back. People sometimes ask me not about this. They don't know about this. But about life generally, how you stay standing when things come at you. I am 67, and I have been asked this at community dinners, and by the women in my book club and by my grandson. Last May, while we were turning the compost, I tell them what my mother told me in the kitchen in Sudbury. Over the ledgers, with the smell of coffee and winter coming through the window. You do not have to announce yourself. You do not have to be loud. You simply have to know, at every moment, what you have and what it is worth. Not in the way a balance sheet knows it. In the way you know your children's voices in a dark house, certain and immediate and yours. Gerald made a sound when he shook my hand. I always notice,